Well, good afternoon on a rainy day. But the beautiful thing about rain is our plants love it and it makes you appreciate the sun even more. But I'm Michael Williamson. I have the honor and privilege of serving as president and CEO of United Way of Southeast Louisiana. And I have the distinct honor of teeing up and introducing our public policy committee chair. And before I do, let me just say, one thing. I want to just share a deep amount of appreciation for the folks that have logged on and the folks that maybe can't log on that have been an important part of our public policy committee journey. Just over 11 years ago in June, we formed the official public policy committee of the board, and Charmaine has been our leader for that since. We started with Kim Sport, who was our first chairwoman, and we've had many since that have taken on the distinction of leading, from a volunteer perspective for our board, the public policy and advocacy work of United Way of Southeast Louisiana. I know you're going to hear it today, but we all know that, we cannot program fund our way out of some of the more intractable challenges that we see in the community. We have to really create and support smart policy. And so I know the agenda today is set up to provide some information for you. So I'm excited for everybody to bear witness and learn and grow together through this process. Also want to give a shout out to not just Charmaine and Pam and Ma and the entire team at United Way of Southeast Louisiana, who are part of a world-class organization because they're world-class people. So speaking of world-class people, we were really fortunate. We were searching high up the mountaintops to find, the next public policy committee chair of the United Way of Southeast Louisiana Board of Trustees, that Dr. Toya Barnes-Teamer was so gracious in her acceptance of our request that she played that role. And so we are so pleased and honored, Toya, that you're lending your expertise, your knowledge and support, as you've always done for United Way, in a variety of roles in support of our public policy and advocacy efforts. So a lot of people know Toya, from her days at ATM strategist, and of course, now at the Teamer Strategy Group, and also the beautiful better half of Rod Teamer, who's I know she was on here to hear all that, but with no further ado, I'd like to introduce to you Dr. Toya Barnes-Teamer, the chair of the United Way of Southeast Louisiana Board of Trustees Public Policy Committee. Toya.
Thank you, Michael. And I do want to just say, I am really passionate about this work. And, the team knows that, since Charmaine and I run into each other all the time when we're talking about advocacy for the citizens of the state of Louisiana in the areas that we are really passionate about, which of course is, education, healthcare, and economic and workforce development. And so, as many of you are aware, we are in the 2024 third extraordinary session, and it convened on Wednesday, November 6th, and has a final adjournment scheduled for no later than 6 p.m. on Monday, November 25th. And the purpose of today's meeting is to receive an in-depth analysis of legislation introducing this tax session and its potential impact on ALICE families. And so I have the honor of actually introducing our guest speaker for today, Jan Molar, who currently serves as Executive Director of Invest in Louisiana. And I read all of your information on a daily basis, look for you everywhere so that I know what's really going on. So Jan has spent more than 2 decades analyzing, reporting, and writing about public policy in Louisiana. Since 2011, he has served Invest in Louisiana as its executive director, where he leads an exceptional team of research, advocacy, outreach, and communication professionals devoted to eliminating racial barriers and promoting public policies that give all Louisianians the chance to reach their highest potential. He has an in-depth knowledge of the state's budget and tax structure. So, Jan, I'm glad somebody does, along with healthcare policy and the public safety net. Before joining LPB, Molar was an award-winning journalist in Washington, D.C., Las Vegas, and Louisiana, where he covered state government for the New Orleans Times-Picayune. Born in Sweden, Molar grew up in Pittsburgh and remains a devoted fan of the city's professional sports teams, which I will not hold against him. And he is a graduate of the American University, excuse me, University. Jan lives with his wife and 2 children in Baton Rouge, where he enjoys coaching soccer and playing occasional rounds of golf. So with no further ado, Jan, I'm just excited that you're here and that you are going to be sharing information.
Did you eat this cookie?
Well, thank you so much for Dr. Barnes-Teamer. It's great to be with so many friends and a few new faces. And for those of you who may not be as familiar with Invest in Louisiana, for most of our history, we were the Louisiana Budget Project. We started in 2006, before I got here, as an initiative of LANO, the Louisiana Association of Nonprofits. And our original mission was really to look at state fiscal policies, budget and tax policies, and how these policies can be used to help lift up low and moderate income families. And if you know us, so we changed our name last year, but the mission is the same. And that's what makes my friends in the media call us, the left-leaning Louisiana Budget Project, now Invest in Louisiana. And I see Julie on the call. She's always fighting on our behalf with the press, because I think we do bring a bias, a point of view, I'm going to say, to these issues. And that point of view, of course, is that the way we tax our people should be fair, and people with lowest incomes should bear the lowest tax burden, both in overall, but in the percentage of their income. People and companies that can most afford it should pay their fair share, and we believe, obviously, that our economy works best when we make the investments necessary in high quality schools, healthcare that's affordable and accessible, education really from birth all the way through college, safe communities, strong infrastructure, and a good public safety net. All of the things that we buy with our tax dollars. And so when we're talking about the debate at the state capitol, I kind of want to start with that, because this really is a debate at its heart about what you think is going to lead to the kind of strong economy that I think everybody, left, right, and center, wants. We all want Louisiana to grow, and we want people to prosper. But there are, I think, some real differences of opinion of how you get there. And there's one side that I think, and the story that's happening right now is we need to make taxes as low as possible, and especially on businesses. We need to make government as small as possible, and that's going to end up growing the economy. I think the point of view that we take is of course, that if you make the right investments in people and communities, you give people access to these things, then that's ultimately how you make Louisiana the kind of a place where people want to live, work, and stay beyond college. So I don't have a big PowerPoint presentation because, frankly, things are moving very quickly at the Capitol. So we'll have all this in a nice presentation soon, but we're still really trying to keep up with all the bills. I think as I speak right now, some of these major bills, at least they're supposed to be on the House floor this afternoon. But I'm going to try to kind of explain what's in the package, what we think is at stake, and then hopefully there'll be some room for questions that I'll try to answer as well as I can. But in the broadest possible strokes, what the governor is trying to do here is both the biggest changes to state tax policy that we've seen in Louisiana in more than 50 years. There have been other attempts at tax reform, but this is the most we've seen since the 1972 Constitution, and the biggest changes to the state constitution that we have seen in more than half a century. So these are two massive undertakings that the governor has taken on. I give him full credit for having a lot of ambition and swinging for the fences. And he's trying to do this in 2.5 weeks at a time when Louisiana citizens really aren't used to paying attention to state politics. So it's a lot for any legislator to try to absorb, particularly legislators who are coming off 3 sessions already. And if you're in your first term in the legislature, they've never been through a tax session. So I think, one of the things we've been telling legislators is you have an entire session to do this stuff. There's a fiscal session coming up in the spring. But so let's talk about kind of the tax policy part of this. And if you've been reading the papers, if you're on this call, you probably know the broad outlines. The governor wants to cut taxes in kind of 3 big buckets. He wants to cut the personal income tax, wants to replace our graduated personal income tax with a 3% flat tax. So right now we have 3 income tax rates. This would go to 1 flat 3% rate. The standard deduction would almost triple. And the retirement exemption, the exemption for retirement income would double. And so under this, practically everybody in Louisiana who earns income would see some kind of income tax cut. And the net cost of this, it varies over the years, but when it's fully flushed out, it would be about $1.4 billion a year. So this is, I think probably what most people would consider a very popular part of the package, but it's also the most costly part of this package because we raise a lot of the revenue that supports states' government from the personal income tax. The second big part of this is eliminating the corporate franchise tax. This is a tax that is very unpopular in the business community. This is a tax basically on capital. It's a tax that is mostly paid by very large companies. Think about like your petrochemical companies, the folks who have factories up and down the Mississippi River. That's not exclusively paid by them, but it's mostly paid by those companies. It brings in about $400 million a year into the state treasury right now. And but then there are also credits that get taken against this. So the fiscal note on this one is a little bit over $500 million. And then the third big part of the tax cut package is the corporate income tax. And the corporate income tax right now is a graduated income tax. The top corporate rate is 7.5%. That would go down to a flat 3.5%. So the biggest on a percentage basis, the biggest tax cut here is for corporations by far. They would be losing the corporate franchise tax entirely, and their income tax would be cut in half, by more than half. An important thing to know about the corporate income tax is the vast majority of companies in Louisiana do not pay the corporate income tax. You have to be organized as a C Corp and not an S Corp. A lot of your small businesses, most of your small businesses are organized as an S Corp or an LLC, and they pay through the personal rate. So the corporate income tax, of course, is only paid on profits. And so you have to be profitable. And the vast amount of revenue that comes in from the corporate income tax is from kind of large multi-state or multinational corporations. So when you think about who's going to benefit from the corporate income tax cut, it's mostly your Exxons and, again, your big petrochemical companies and so on. There's a study that came out that shows about 95% of the benefit of the corporate income tax cut would flow to people out of state, because really you're talking about a tax cut that would benefit shareholders of those corporations. So all told, you're looking at, 3 big tax cut bills moving through the legislature. They've all come out of the House committee. And most of them are waiting today on the House floor. I think the corporate income tax cut is the piece that's not coming up today. It's coming up later this week. Now, you can't cut all these taxes and still have a balanced budget. So the other piece of this is the taxes that are going up. Well, actually, let me back up and talk a little bit about the corporate income tax, because one of the ways that they are reducing the fiscal note, the corporate income tax cut would be about half of $600 million a year in lost revenue. But the fiscal note is a lot smaller than that, because as part of that corporate income tax bill, they also eliminate some major tax credits. And I think this is really important, particularly for New Orleans, because what they want to do, one of the ways they want to kind of offset the cost of the corporate income tax cut is by eliminating some of the big tax credit programs that are in state government that support jobs and specific industries. And some of them are not exclusive to New Orleans, but really benefit New Orleans in particular. The film program, most of you all know, ironically, years ago, we used to be quite a critic of the film program, but the film production tax credit in Louisiana, it's about $150 million a year that we spend to kind of underwrite and encourage the movie industry to locate in Louisiana. A lot of that industry is based in the New Orleans area, although we have a studio in Baton Rouge, and I know like 50 Cent is coming into Shreveport, so it's not just in New Orleans. If that credit goes away, the film industry goes away. Let's just be very clear. They are here because of the credit. And if that credit goes away, you're not going to have a film industry in Louisiana. So that's a choice that the legislature would be making if they adopt the corporate income tax bill as written. There's the historic preservation tax credit, which, we learned from some of the folks who testified. This is kind of it's not unique to Louisiana, but Louisiana has one of the most robust historic preservation tax credits. Developers use this tax credit to make the balance sheet work on a lot of downtown revitalization projects, a lot of affordable housing projects. These tax credits get used in combination with federal tax credits. So you have a whole big industry of folks who take older rundown pieces of property and turn them into something beautiful and usable, whether it's a mixed-use development or a business or some kind of housing or something. So it's not all benefiting Alice populations, but there's a lot of economic activity and a lot of economic revitalization that we buy with that tax credit. That tax credit would go away, and so would a lot of these projects, which just simply wouldn't balance and the money just wouldn't work for these developers. I'm not a property developer, but I take them at their word when they say that. And then the third one is the digital media tax credit. This was a little bit younger of a tax credit. This came up, was developed when Bobby Jindal was governor. If you remember, Stephen Moray, as the Secretary of Economic Development, really wanted to see if we could get a tech industry in Louisiana. So we developed what is one of the strongest digital media tax credits in the country. And a lot of the digital media jobs, particularly in the New Orleans area, are as a result of that tax credit. It has really encouraged people to bring in software development, high-tech jobs. And so we heard actually in committee on Sunday from some folks who had come to New Orleans, people who had come back to New Orleans, started companies, grown those companies, are employing, dozens or if not hundreds of people. And they would probably be at risk of leaving and moving out of state, because Louisiana is still a tough place to be a high-tech company. A lot of that, of course, happens in places like Austin and Silicon Valley and New York and other places. So the corporate income tax cut, again, corporations and their shareholders would save $600 million, but the cost to the state would be less than that. It would still cost the state a net revenue loss, but it would be offset by the loss of those tax credits. to pay for these tax cuts that they're proposing, they want to raise taxes, and it's about $1.4 billion in new and renewed sales taxes. Now, if we want to back up a little bit and talk about Louisiana's overall tax structure, and forgive me if you've heard me say this before, Louisiana is already a low tax state. That's not my data. That is kind of universally accepted. Louisiana does not tax its citizens more than most states. In fact, we tax our citizens as a percentage of our overall economy. We tax them less than most states. We're not the lowest, but we are closer to the bottom than we are to the top. We also have a tax system that is regressive in Louisiana. What we mean by that is that people with low and moderate income pay a higher percentage of their total income in state and local taxes than people at the very top. So if you are in the bottom 40%, you're paying somewhere about 12 or 13% of your total income goes to your state and local taxes. If you're in the top 1%, which means your average income is somewhere north of $1.8 million, then about 6.5% of that goes to pay your state and local taxes. So you pay a lower rate, even though you're paying, 6.5% of $2 million is obviously a lot more than 13% of $20,000. But we have a regressive system that asks more of low-income families than it asks of high-income families. And the reason for that is because Louisiana has some of the highest sales taxes anywhere in the country. And when you just look at our rate, our combined state and local sales tax rate, we are in fact the highest sales taxes in the country. Usually we're like right there 1 and 2 with Tennessee, but I think right now we're at the very top. Our personal income taxes in Louisiana are actually already among the lowest. We are 4th from the bottom among the 41 states that have a personal income tax. So we are already very high on sales taxes, low on income taxes. And of course, this plan is to make us even lower on income taxes and to make up the difference with sales taxes. So how do they want to make up the difference on sales taxes? Well, the first part is, if you've heard about the fiscal cliff that Louisiana is facing, the fiscal cliff is really a problem that the legislature created for itself in 2018 when it put 2 temporary sales taxes on the books. This was when John Bel Edwards was in his first term, and they had a budget shortfall. There was a 0.45% state sales tax that was passed that year, and a separate 2% sales tax on business utilities. Those 2 sales taxes together are about $650 million. They're supposed to expire on July 1st of next year. And so they would simply just be renewed permanently. So we would have a permanent 4.45% sales tax instead of that going back to 4%. And businesses would keep paying 2% sales tax on their utility bills. So that's a big part of it. The other part of it is they want to get rid of a lot of sales tax exemptions that are in the law right now. There are hundreds of exemptions to the current state sales tax, and a lot of those would go away. I think one thing to note to the United Way, because you all worked really hard on this, was doing away with the state sales tax on diapers, tampons, and feminine hygiene products. That exemption would go away. So those things would be subject to sales taxes again. There's a whole bunch of other exemptions. There's even one for Bibles. There's a lot of specific exemptions that go to nonprofit organizations that would go away. So they renew the expiring sales taxes. They eliminate some of the exemptions. Then they want to expand the sales tax in a couple of ways. They want to expand it to digital goods. And that's essentially streaming services. So we would be paying sales taxes on Netflix and Amazon Prime and things like that. And then the biggest thing is they want to expand the sales tax base to include 42 different services that aren't currently taxed. And so that's where you hear about, dog grooming and landscaping and home repairs and maintenance. So if your dishwasher breaks and somebody comes to your house to fix it, you're paying a sales tax on that. That is something that would be, an extra $500 million a year in new sales taxes just to the state. But it also is a whole lot of small businesses around the state who are all of a sudden going to be in the business of collecting and remitting sales taxes to state government. So you're really adding a lot of compliance to a lot of small businesses and sole proprietors and things like that. And then the last thing that they want to do, and this was a bill, and I don't think it's part of the governor's package, is they want to eliminate the earned income tax credit. And that is something that, United Way and Charmaine and I have been in the trenches for over a decade fighting to preserve and expand the earned income tax credit. This is one of the best, if not the best tax credit we have on the books in Louisiana, because it's a tax credit that rewards and subsidizes work. It is a very simple credit to administer. It goes to, I think, about 1 in 3 tax filers in Louisiana. It gives them a little bit more money in their state tax refund. And again, it only goes to low-income working families, most of them with children. And it is tied to the federal credit, so it's very easy to administer. If you're interested, I'm going to just put in the chat a link to district fact sheets that we produced and recently updated. We updated them last spring. If you click on that link, you can see a map, or there's a pull-down table for every single House and Senate district, and it gives you a fact sheet about that district, the economic conditions. It also, there's a part of that that tells you exactly how many people in each district claimed the EITC and how much money that brings back. So this is a tax credit that really brings state dollars back to every community in the state by giving people a little bit more money to spend in their communities. The people who get this credit through their tax refund, we know that they spend it very close to home on basic necessities. People aren't going to the beach with this money. They are catching up on overdue bills, buying school supplies, and just taking care of basic necessities. So this credit, House Bill 17 by Chairman Neil Reiser, or not Chairman Neil Reiser, Representative Neil Reiser, would do away with the earned income tax credit. And I think that would be a major step backwards. When you add all this up, and I think if you take one thing away from this presentation, and this is, I think, very critical, because the governor, and I'm not calling the governor a liar. I'm not doing that. But I think the governor is misinformed because he is telling people that this tax plan is a way to solve the fiscal cliff, that when all of this is done, everything is going to balance out. The state's own numbers, the Legislative Fiscal Office has analyzed each one of these bills. So these are not numbers that we are making up. These are not numbers that we calculated on our own. Our numbers come from the Legislative Fiscal Office. When you add all of this up, we are going to cut revenues by well over $500 million a year over the current baseline. So the state is going to have a lot less money available to spend on whatever it wants to spend it on. Now, you think $500 million isn't much when you think about a $47 billion state budget. That's the total state budget. Keep in mind that the general fund portion of that is a little bit over $12 billion, and the discretionary part of the state general fund, the money that our legislators actually have control over, is $3.6 billion. So when you talk about taking $500 million out of the state general fund, out of state revenues, you're really talking about almost a 20% cut in the discretionary dollars. So whatever part of the budget that you care about, whether it's early childhood education or funding for higher education or healthcare or housing. I was talking to the housing folks this morning, or something else entirely. Maybe it's state police. Maybe you think we need to be building more youth prisons, which I personally don't think we should. But whatever part of the budget you care about, if it's a discretionary dollar in state government, it's going to be harder to fund those priorities if this plan goes through as proposed. So I think our biggest concern about this is, they do some things in here by increasing the standard deduction. I think they've managed to make it so that everybody gets a tax cut. Even when you offset it with some of, and everybody's tax situation is different. But even when you count the extra services, I think most households in Louisiana, except for the very, very poorest who aren't paying any income tax right now, would get some kind of a net tax cut. I don't know how it would work with the earned income tax credit taken away. We haven't done that math. But if everybody gets a tax cut, that means we have a lot less money to run the state. So I think our concern is that we are going to very quickly, within a couple of years, be looking at the kind of budget shortfalls that we saw a decade ago when we saw that, Louisiana led the nation in cuts to higher education. If you talk to folks in higher ed, LSU still hasn't recovered from the cuts that they went through during that period. Our teachers are falling farther and farther behind their peers in the South and their peers around the country. And we are not doing even, remotely as much as we should to fund things like early childhood education and services and supports that our communities need to be successful. So that's kind of our big concern about this. Talk briefly about the constitutional amendment. And that is House Bill 7. That's on the floor this afternoon. It may be being discussed as we speak. I'm not sure, but that is, and I'd be lying to you, and I don't think I'm alone in saying I can't tell you everything that's in this, because we have constitutional amendments on the ballot in Louisiana every single year. But this is the biggest. This is an attempt to completely rewrite Article 7 of the state constitution. That's the longest and most complicated section of the Constitution. The bill itself is 139 pages long, and it does a lot of things. So we can talk about a few parts of what it does. I guarantee you cannot find a single legislator out of 144 who can explain to you everything that's in this constitutional amendment. I'll tell you the main thing that it does, and the thing that we are watching the closest, is what it does to two key state savings accounts. And that's why, the reason that this is coming up in the special session is because the constitutional amendment is one way they're trying to make the money work. And for that, we should kind of talk about where the state was 9 years ago, because when Governor John Bel Edwards took office, there was one a rainy day fund in the state treasurer and in the state treasury, and the legislature had been taking money out of that rainy day fund because there had been a lot of rainy days under Bobby Jindal. So we had about $200 million in the bank when John Bel Edwards came in. When in 2016, former House Speaker Pro Tem Walt Leger got a constitutional amendment passed that created a second rainy day fund called the Revenue Stabilization Trust Fund. So for the last 8 years or so, we've had two rainy day funds. And the money that goes into that second rainy day fund is a lot of the corporate tax collections above a certain threshold. And for the last few years, especially post-COVID, that fund has taken in a lot of money. So the bottom line is in a little bit over 8 years, we went from having $200 million in the state savings account to having almost $4 billion in those savings accounts. And the new rainy day fund actually has more money in it than the old rainy day fund. What the constitutional amendment does is it eliminates that second rainy day fund. It collapses the two rainy day funds into one rainy day fund, and it raises the cap. So what would happen is that, instead of having two funds with about a little under $4 billion, you would have one rainy day fund, and it would be capped at around $2.8 billion. That leaves an extra $1 billion in a savings account that they want to raid to pay off some of these tax credit obligations. And so one of the key things that they want to do, for example, is pay off some of the outstanding obligations that they have for the film program, for the historic tax credit, digital media. The other thing they want to do, and one of the things that frankly catching a lot of heartburn among the business community is one of the tax credits they want to get rid of is the inventory tax credit. The inventory tax credit is one of those weird only in Louisiana tax credits where companies that have a lot of inventory, they pay a property tax locally on that inventory. That's the inventory tax. Most states have gotten rid of their inventory tax. What Louisiana did, instead of getting rid of its inventory tax, they created a state tax credit. So a company will pay that inventory tax at the local level and then come back to the state and get their money back through the tax credit. So the companies are held harmless and the locals get their money. Well, what the Landry administration wants to do is they want to kill the state tax, the inventory tax credit. Well, business isn't happy about that because all of a sudden they would actually have to pay the inventory tax that they've been getting refunded all these years. And so the administration wants to use some of the money in that trust fund to give local governments a one-time payment in exchange for getting rid of that inventory tax. So if you're the city of New Orleans or you're Baton Rouge, they're saying, here, we'll offer you $15 million up front, but you got to get rid of this recurring revenue source. And so there's a lot of folks in local government who are very concerned about this because, they might be okay for a year or two, but 3 years from now, they're going to have a huge hole in their budget because they're not getting that revenue from the inventory tax. And if they decide to keep the inventory tax, then they're going to look uncompetitive next to the parishes that decide to get rid of theirs. So one of the real kind of inside the Capitol questions that's going to be resolved over the next few days is going to be the fate of this inventory tax and this inventory tax credit. Anyway, I feel like I've been talking a long time. And I want to stop talking and see if there are any questions. But I really appreciate y'all spending a little time on a damp Tuesday afternoon after a major national election to talk about state tax policy. Y'all, it's dry, but it's really, really important, and it matters for the things we're going to be able to fund. Oh, and House Bill 7 is on the floor right now. So if you want to know, but if you want to learn what's in this constitutional amendment, you can tune into the legislature. I don't want anybody to tune this out, but.
Yeah, and it looks like Julie had a question in the chat. What is total cost of the corporate income tax cut?
So again, corporations would save about $600 million a year, but and I've got a spreadsheet here. And so the corporate income tax, the net cost after you do everything, it's $509 million over 5 years. And it varies. So it would be $120 million this budget year, 112 million next year, 187 million the year after that, 100 million after that. And then by 2029, we will have paid off all those tax credits, and it'll actually be a net gain of $10 million, according to the fiscal office. But again, the cost of that, the reason, corporations are still saving money, their income taxes are being cut in half. The reason the fiscal note isn't bigger is because we are killing the film industry, we are killing the historic rehabilitation industry, and we are killing the high-tech industry in New Orleans.
Yeah, what's so interesting, Jan, about that film industry tax is I remember when it came into existence, I was on the community and technical college side. But from a post-secondary education perspective, many of our institutions modified their course offerings in order to meet the needs of the industry. So it's going to be interesting to see if that tax goes away and then the industry goes away when institutions had modified, their curriculum and their offerings to meet the needs of that industry. So that's going to be really interesting.
I agree, and I think there's a lot of there's parts of the film industry that's mobile. A crew will come in and they'll spend 6 months in Louisiana filming a movie or a show and then go back to Hollywood. But then there's big parts of it that's permanent, and people who live here, and I have friends, I'm sure most of y'all have friends in the film industry. They might not work all year round, but they'll work on a production and they'll make good money, and then they'll wait for the next one to come in. And a lot of those are good union jobs. I think that the industry was at the witness table saying, the average annual salary is about $65,000 for those crew jobs. So, I don't think the actors are getting rich, but I think the crew are at least making a above median wage from doing this work in the film industry.
Right. There is a question in the chat. Is it possible for only parts of the bill to pass, or is it all or nothing?
That's a great question, and that's probably the biggest question. I think it's when the governor gave his session opening speech, he was very clear that he wanted this to be a whole package, that everything works together, and if you start pulling it apart, it could all fall apart. And in a sense, that's true. Like, they can't just, if they decided that all we want to do is cut the income tax and the corporate taxes, but we're not going to vote for any of the sales tax stuff, you're not going to have a budget next year.
Hello.
But
Blue, no, Central City.
Hold on one second, Jan. Okay, thanks. Maria put herself on mute. Sorry for that.
But I think there is, so I'd be shocked if everything passes exactly as written. But we don't know that yet. Certainly I think the governor is going to get something out of this. I don't think you call a special session and roll the dice like this and put your kind of use this much political capital if you don't think you're going to get anything. So I think somebody's taxes are getting cut, something is getting done, and you talk to different legislators and they have different, you can talk to 5 lobbyists and get 5 different opinions, and you can talk to 5 legislators and get 5 different opinions on what's going to pass and what's going to fail. And, this person over here cares more about the constitutional amendment and doesn't care about the tax part. And this person only cares about, the corporate franchise tax. And then this person over here is, there's a lot of people who have heartburn about the sales tax piece of this. And I think my biggest concern, besides the fiscal note, is just the uncertainty, because if anybody has time, read the fiscal note on House Bill 7, because there is just enormous uncertainty about how this will play out to the state fisc, and they don't really like venture a guess, but they kind of give a high end and a low end of how it'll affect different dedications in the state, and it is a dramatic difference. So there's a lot of uncertainty, and if I were a legislator, and look, I think I haven't talked to the governor, doesn't call and ask my advice, shockingly, but I've heard from several people that the governor really doesn't want this to be something that busts the budget and that leads to deep budget cuts. But if I were a legislator, I would be very worried about that's where we're heading, because I think, there are folks who will tell you and who honestly believe that if we pass all these changes, we're going to reverse out migration and people and businesses are going to move back to Louisiana, and everything's going to be rosy. That is a genuine belief by a lot of people who support this package. But I think if they're wrong, we are looking at budget shortfalls and the kind of pain that we went through from 2009 to 2016.
Wow. So I'm paying attention to the time, but Jan, we have two more questions in the chat. The first is, what measures can the state implement to ensure that a sales tax on digital media does not deepen the digital divide, especially for low-income communities that rely on affordable access to digital resources for education, work, and personal development?
That's a really good question. And I don't know if I have a great answer to this. I don't know if the digital goods tax applies to like home internet, like Wi-Fi. I honestly don't know. I know they're going to tax my Netflix subscription and my Amazon Prime subscription. I don't know if my AT&T fiber subscription that I pay every month is going to be subject to sales tax or not. I can check on that, but I think that is certainly a concern. I will say that like that is probably out of all the revenue measures, that is the lowest one. I think the fiscal, at one point they were saying that the digital goods tax was going to raise like $100 million a year, and the fiscal office came back and said it's going to be $39,800,000 a year. So it's not as much money that we're taking from folks as some of these other things. I think the bigger impact is going to be, when your air conditioner breaks down and it's June, and that $2,000 bill to have your condenser like that. I mean, who hasn't had that happen? That's all of a sudden going to be $2,200. So I think that's where people are going to feel this. And I think and I kind of think about, what about all these small proprietors? In my neighborhood, we have a guy who comes and cuts people's lawns. Is that man going to be collecting sales tax? Maybe, maybe not. If he decides that he's just going to ask you to Venmo, then he's breaking the law. And so, and who's going to be out there trying to collect that? So I think there are a lot of questions about how and now other states have done this. So like, I'm not saying that like Louisiana, if Louisiana goes down the road, there are other states that tax these services. So it wouldn't make us completely unusual, but it would mean that we're doubling down on sales taxes where we are already paying a lot of sales tax as a trade-off for these lower income taxes for individuals and large corporations.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned other states, because in the chat we have a question. I've read that all the states around, something, let me just jump to another one. So let me just go back so I can make sure. I read that all the states around us also have corporate franchise taxes. So we would be the outlier. Would we be blowing a 500 million hole in the budget?
Well, that's the fiscal note. I mean, anybody can go online and read the fiscal note on the franchise tax. And so if we eliminate the corporate franchise tax, and I'll be honest, that seems to be the most popular tax cut with the legislators. You know, they've been hearing from business lobbyists for years that this is the one that they want to get rid of. You know, but again, that's $500 million a year that we collect right now that supports the needs of the state. So it's and Julie, to your point, yes, our neighboring states, you know, the majority of states don't have a corporate franchise tax, but the majority of our neighboring states do have a corporate franchise tax. It looks a little different in other states. We also made some reforms to the franchise tax in 2021, so it no longer hits small and medium-sized businesses in the same way. You have to be a pretty substantial business in order to get hit by the franchise tax, and the big franchise tax bills go to the, you know, to the really big, the big boys.
There's another question. Which sectors of the state will see the largest FY25 budget cuts account for the immediate shortfalls?
Okay, let me see here. What sectors of the state? It's impossible to say because the budget doesn't come out. And again, another reason why we should be doing this in the spring and not in November is because in the spring, there's a budget in front of legislators. You know, the governor presents his executive budget in late February, I think right before Mardi Gras, it's due. The budget is based on the revenue forecast. And so when you're doing tax policy at the same time as budgets, then you see the trade-off. You know, if you want to pay teachers more, raise the money. If you want to cut the budget, you know, if you want to cut taxes, here's the trade-off. And that's frankly what I love about state government, is because they don't have the luxury that they have in Washington, where you can cut taxes and raise spending and put it all on the tab, you know, add it to the deficit. State government has to balance its budget every year. And so it's, you know, if you want to spend $1, you got to raise $1. I will say one other thing, but in general, we know that the two parts of the budget that are the most exposed are healthcare and higher education. K through 12 education is protected through a constitutional funding formula, the MFP, the Minimum Foundation Program. So teachers may not get a raise, but that base per pupil amount stays in the Constitution. So it's really hard to cut public schools, you know, because that's a formula. But you know, LSU and UNO and LSU Shreveport and Delgado, they all rely on state general funds. And so what happened, you know, if we go back to the Bobby Jindal era, in 8 years, we went from having a higher education enterprise that was funded 2/3 by state taxpayer support and 1/3 by tuition and fees. And we turned that on its head. So where it's now 1/3 state support, 2/3 tuition and fees. So when you talk about cutting higher ed, it can lead to program cuts and little cuts on campuses to, you know, professors and programs, and maybe you have fewer supports for students. But what you're also really doing is pushing the cost onto students and families. And that's one thing. If you're a kid on TOPS, you may not feel that quite as much. But if you're a first-gen student trying to get an education, trying to get ahead and better yourself, that cost difference, if tuition is going to go up and those fees go up, that could be the deciding point whether somebody goes to college or says, you know, the heck with this, I'm just going to work, or I'm going to work a little longer and delay this education that I've been dreaming of. So education cuts, particularly higher education cuts, have real world consequences, particularly for the Alice population. Because, I think if you're smart, you're going to think hard before you take on a lot of debt to go to school. And we've seen, and particularly among men, the college rates are frankly going way down among men. And that costs us in the long run. When people decide to not go to college because of the cost, then you're really, you're hurting yourself in the future, and you're harming your long-term economic growth and potential.
Jan, can I ask you in relationship to that, could you explain to our participants today what's happening with the 8G fund? Because today in education, I've got to tell you, this was designed to actually assist K-12 and higher ed. Could you talk a little bit about that? Because Bessie was available in education today to present on sharing with us what that was, but they're delaying it until House Bill 7 gets heard, and hopefully those questions will resonate on the floor today. But I think this is really important.
Yeah, so that's a great question, and thank you, Charmaine. Forgive me, I was not in education today. I've been sitting at this desk since 7 a.m. on various calls and phone calls. But the 8G fund is a constitutional fund that was created in the 1980s. The voters approved this, and that is the money that Louisiana gets from offshore oil. And it goes into this fund, and that money gets, I think, mostly split between higher education and K through 12. And one of the things they want to do in this constitutional amendment is they want to basically liquidate the 8G fund. So the 8G fund, which now pays out a little bit money, year after year for these things, would go away, and they would use the money in the 8G fund. I'm not sure if it's all of it. You may have heard the governor and his supporters talk about a permanent teacher pay raise. This is very important because, and I say this with an absolute bias, because I have a third grade teacher who sleeps next to me and is the mother of my children. And so for the last 2 years, public school teachers have not gotten a pay raise. What they have gotten in lieu of a pay raise is a one-time stipend of $2,000 because the legislature said we can't afford to give you a permanent pay raise. So right now, and they pay those out in kind of 2 lump sums. The idea behind this 8G fund trickeration is they want to use some of this money in the fund to pay off debt in the teachers' retirement system. That in turn would create savings. That's a recurring expense for retirement obligations that the retirement systems don't have to pay. And then that money would be used for a $2,000 permanent pay raise for teachers. But that pay raise would only take the place of the stipend. So if you're a teacher, you're going to lose the $2,000 stipend, and it's going to get replaced by a permanent raise. That's good news, I guess, because you don't have to worry about your stipend going away the next year. But no teacher should think that they're getting more money, because they're not. This is, they're just getting the same amount of money. They just don't have to worry about it being taken away. And again, I think my big concern, and Charmaine, I think what you're getting at is we're going to make this one-time buy down of retirement system debt, which in theory is not, if you have surplus dollars, I think it is a good idea to use that money to pay off some of your debt. Just like if you get a Christmas bonus from your boss, you use some of that to pay down your credit card debt. That's and it saves you money in the long run. But teachers should not be under the illusion that that they're getting a permanent raise. They're just getting what they have now.
Well, Charmaine, it's 2:30, so I think I probably need to turn this back over to you.
Well, I want to thank everybody who took time out of their crazy schedules to join us today. I think having this conversation and having a subject matter expert like Jan available to really walk us through and to give us this good information, I hope that it prepares you to better understand what is actually happening currently. I encourage you to tune in. Go to the legislative website, listen. You can go to the archives and review any one of the committee hearings that have already been heard. I invite you to visit Invest in Louisiana's website and the United Way of Southeast Louisiana's website for regular updates on what's happening at the legislative session. But I hope today you recognize just how important building collaboratives of being able to work with your partners in the not-for-profit community is. I certainly am no tax expert, in being able to have at our disposal at United Way, Jan, the enormous amount of research and dedication that your staff has given to all of these issues, I think is a service to each and every one of us today. And I can't thank you enough for taking time out of your busy schedule to present today. I thank you, Toya, for your extraordinary leadership. And to each and every one of you, please rest assured this is not the end. This is our first discussion. And I just hope that you leave here today better understanding that we all have got to pay attention to what's happening, because when it comes to fiscal and tax policy, every single citizen is impacted by that. So please pay attention. Michael, I don't know if you want to say anything as our president and CEO to close us out either, but I welcome your comments.
No, you said it all. Thank you for everybody participating. Jan is always insightful, and Toya, thank you for your leadership.
Thank you all. Thank you all for joining. Have a great rest of your week.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.